Welcome to Ethical Hacking Essentials. We are in Module 6. We're going to have a look at network level attacks and countermeasures. Let's get started. So let's have a look at the module objectives. We're going to start off with understanding packet sniffing, types of sniffing, various sniffing techniques and tools. We're going to look at sniffing countermeasures because you want to make sure that you can sniff networks. Maybe you're on the red team or something like that, but you don't want an attacker to be able to sniff your network, so you need these countermeasures. We're going to look also in this module at denial of service and distributed denial of service attacks and different types of attacks and tools and countermeasures. So sniffing and then denial of service. And then we're going to look at one more segment, which is session hijacking and session hijacking tools and countermeasures. So you see we have three different themes in this module. And let's start with the first one, which is sniffing. What is sniffing? It's not just something you do with your nose. No, this is something that you do with a network interface card. So let's talk about it. We're going to understand some packet sniffing concepts. So what is packet sniffing? Well, in order to really, at the lowest level, understand packet sniffing, you need to understand the idea of what's called host-to-host communication. Host-to-host communication. And I don't actually have the ability or the time right now to explain everything that happens with host-to-host communication. But I will tell you this, that if you have a laptop, if you have a phone, if you have a desktop computer system that's plugged into a wired network, whether it's Wi-Fi, whether it's wired, every network interface card produces what's called an Ethernet frame. The Ethernet frame starts with what's called a preamble. In fact, will you do me a favor? Open up a tab, you know what I'm going to say, right? To DuckDuckGo or to Google, type in Ethernet, E-T-H-E-R-N-E-T, Ethernet frame, hit enter, and then go to images. And in images, you'll see the representation of an Ethernet frame. In that Ethernet frame, you have the preamble, you have the destination and source, MAC address, and then you have protocol information. And then what you have inside the frame is the payload. Inside that payload, you have a packet. In that packet, we have a source and destination IP address, all kinds of protocol information. And then inside that packet, you have a TCP, and if you're running TCP, segment. In that TCP segment, you have a source and destination port. And inside that TCP segment, along with other protocol potential information, is your payload. What is the payload? Well, imagine that you have these frames moving in and out of the transceiver of your NIC, of your network interface card. How many frames are we talking about? Well, how fast is your transceiver? If you are on a wired network, it's possible to get up to, let's say that you have a 1 gigabit per second interface. That's a billion frames, a billion bits per second, which is hundreds of millions of frames per second. That's a lot. And so when I click on a link and a website shows up, downloads, what I didn't see is all those frames coming in one at a time, each of those frames bringing in a pixel, another pixel, a set of pixels, a text phrase, another part of a text phrase. If you were to slow it down, you could see the web page that you downloaded being built as the hundreds of millions, or probably in this case, it's only going to be thousands, hundreds of thousands of frames that have all that other payloads that build what you see on your screen, among many other things. So what a packet sniffer does is it captures that data that's being sent. So when I click on a link, it's not just downloading a web page, when I first click on that link, I have to find out what the IP address of that site is. There's communication I can watch on a packet sniffer. I might need to do a TCP three-way handshake with that resource before I communicate through TCP. That shows up on the sniffer. I might then start to have a TCP communication and stream the download of that web page. And there might be specific elements of that web page or that web app that have external locations, and those need to be worked out. They need to be tested. There needs to be a handshake between those elements. So there's a lot going on in the background. The bottom line is all of it is encapsulated in frames. Those frames at layer 2 of the OSI model we're able to see. It allows us to see traffic, especially if it's wireless, across the network, depending on where we're plugged in. If any of that information is clear text like telnet, or clear text like syslog traffic, or FTP traffic, we'll be able to see the payload of that frame, which is carrying the packet, which is carrying the TCP segment, which is carrying the payload, which is a string of text that says password. Right? So that's what packet sniffing is all about. Opening up the frames that are captured on that NIC, on that network interface card, and being able to read the contents and watch the data flows. That's what we're looking at. So a sniffer, again, it has a NIC, a network interface card, but it's set to what we call promiscuous mode. What in the world is promiscuous mode? Well, a network interface card normally will look at the contents of the frame. The preamble comes 1010, etc., saying the following communication is an Ethernet frame, and then the first thing that it will read is the destination address. So here's the destination address. It hits my NIC. Does the destination MAC address match the MAC address of my NIC? If it doesn't, a normal NIC will just drop it, delete that frame. But a NIC in promiscuous mode doesn't even care. That could be a MAC address for another computer. It could be a MAC address for this computer. It could be, I don't care. I'm just going to take every single frame that comes to my NIC, that touches my NIC, that works in my wireless card, that works in my network card, anything that touches it. The promiscuous mode NIC will read it, right? So that's what we're looking at. And so every frame gets read in a promiscuous mode NIC. And so that leads to types of sniffing. One would be passive sniffing. So what you can do is you can just listen, watch all the traffic. You can even plug into an old style hub. That really actually helps you get even more traffic and look at everything that's being delivered and just not injecting any information into the network. And it's really nice. It's stealthy. Hardly anyone will know unless they check. So that's a very good way. So if you have Wireshark or any of the other type of packet sniffers we're going to be talking about, mainly they're going to be passive, just listening in, right? So for instance, if nobody knew that you were listening in on a conversation, they wouldn't maybe care if you're just listening in. But as soon as you inject something into the conversation, say, hey, that's wrong. Oh, then all of a sudden they're all over your case, right? So active sniffing is different. It's when you actually interact with the system. So let's say you have a network that's running on a switch. One of the problems with a switched network is you can only sniff conversations between your device and a specific secondary device, unless they are broadcast or some other types of multicast frames that you can see. But in a switch-based network, if you want to see everybody else, you'll need to inject something into the conversation. And one of the best ways to see what's going on with everyone else is to inject ARP, Address Resolution Protocol packets. What ARP does is it is there to find an association between the IP address of a host on a network and its MAC address. Right now, if you were to open up a command prompt or a PowerShell prompt and you typed in ARP and then the space bar and hit -A, you would see a list of both dynamic and static ARP entries. and they're MAC addresses and IP addresses. So these ARP entries, using ARP and flooding ARP to flood the switch with a bunch of extra MAC address entries. So you have this content addressable memory, which is a type of switch memory. In fact, some Cisco switches have what's called TCAM, which is tertiary content addressable memory. But in this case, it's really just a MAC table, a table of MAC addresses, ports on the switch, and VLANs and a couple other pieces of information that's held in this MAC table in CAM on the switch. What you can do with this memory is you can overflow it. A typical switch, workgroup switch, maybe a 24-port switch, has about 8,192 MAC entries available on the MAC table, but you can switch it up to over 131,000. But either way, if it's only 24 ports, only a few VLANs, you would think that that table never gets full. But there are tools that someone can use to flood that table and make it so that the switch behaves like a hub, meaning that the attacker can watch all traffic on the switch. There are other active techniques for sniffing: MAC flooding, DNS poisoning, ARP poisoning, DHCP attacks, switch port stealing, spoofing attacks. There are so many different ways of active sniffing. And here's one of the ways that an attacker will hack a network using a sniffer. The first thing that the attacker is going to do is go ahead and connect themselves to a switchboard. Well, how do you do that? Well, you go into a conference room, for instance, and there's a port open on the wall. You take your cable, plug it in. All right, that's number one. Number two, they're going to find who they want to hack. So there's a target of the attack. And I don't know which one it is, but it's one of these computer systems over here. Number three, the traffic that's destined for the machine is now going to be redirected to the attacker. And the way they're going to do that, number four, is they're going to use a discovery tool to learn about the topology, and then they're going to poison the victim's machine using an ARP spoofing technique. Now, all that traffic is going to be redirected to the attacker. And now that the traffic from the victim's machine is redirected to the attacker can take all that information and watch what's going on, just steal everything, monitor, sniff, that's what we call it, passwords, sensitive data, and all of that from redirected traffic. There are protocols that we use commonly on networks that are vulnerable to sniffing. And the reason that they're vulnerable to sniffing is because they're not encrypted by default. They're not protected. Telnet that you use to, for instance, manage a switch or a router, or get a administrator prompt from a Linux or a Microsoft box, is completely plain text. So anything you type, all the keystrokes, all the usernames, the passwords. If I have a Cisco router and I type the command show run and I'm telnetted in, the entire configuration of the router will be listed out, and anybody who's sniffing that telnet traffic will now have the entire configuration of my router or my switch for devices like that. Also HTTP. We're used to using HTTPS. HTTPS is encrypted. HTTP is not. And so anything done with HTTP can be sniffed and looked at. POP for email, IMAP for email, SMTP or NNTP. These are used for network management and time management. Clear text, right? FTP, which is ports 20 and 21. It's like a file server online, and it all can be read in clear text because the protocols themselves are vulnerable to sniffing. Now let's have a look at some of the techniques that are often used for sniffing. And one of those I mentioned a little bit earlier is MAC flooding. So we take that MAC table, we fill it up with entries until it's full, and then it acts like a hub. Now, what is the problem with it acting like a hub? Now, most people taking this class have never had the opportunity to use a hub, or maybe you've never even had the opportunity to work with a switch. There's a big difference. Back in the 80s and 90s, networks were put together using hubs. Here is how a hub works. So let's say I have a 4-port hub, and on port 1 I have a computer connected, and on port 4 I have another computer connected. The computer on port 4 sends information into port 4. It's connected to port 4, so it sends information into that port, and that information is repeated at all of all the ports. The computer on port 1 sends information into the port. That information is repeated out of all ports. So a hub is like a multi-port repeater. If I had a 24-port hub, they usually never got that big, but I could plug into one port. Since the hub repeats all the traffic from any communication on the hub, I could plug into one port on the hub and watch the traffic for the entire network. On a switch, it's much different. With a switch, let's say I have an 8-port switch, and I have a device on port 1 and a device on port 8. The device on port 1 sends a frame to the device on port 8. Guess what? Only the device on port 8 sees that frame. There is not 1 ounce of communication on port 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. Only on those 2 that communicate. I don't care who's on the other ports. So here's what you do. The attacker gets a tool. There's one called MACOF, as you see over here, right? We run it. We flood the 8-port switch or the 24-port switch, fill up the MAC table till it's overflowing. And then when there's a communication going from the computer on port 1 to the computer on port 8, it just sends it out all the ports like a hub. And so the attacker can watch, listen to, scan, sniff all of the traffic on the network as they send out 131,000 MAC entries per minute flooding that switch. So that's what MAC flooding is. There are also other types of attacks that we can do. One of these is DHCP starvation. This is more of a denial of service attack. And so what happens is, let's say that I have a network that has 20 VLANs on it. A VLAN is a virtual local area network. And these 20 VLANs are going to be on separate logical networks. So one of them might be on the 192.168.20 network with a /24. And there might be one on a 30 network, one on a 40, one on a 45 network, etc. So we have all these different logical addressed networks. Now, in this case, each of the networks will have up to 254 addresses available for each of the hosts on each of these 20 subnets for these 20 VLANs. So the attacker, what they do is they use a tool. Uracina, I think, is one of those that would do this. But you use a tool, and what you do is you fake a whole bunch of requests to each of the scopes of addresses for the DHCP server and flood it with requests until all of the addresses in the DHCP server are used up. There's none left. They're all leased out. And then any device that tries to use that network and that DHCP server won't be able to get an IP address, won't be able to talk on the network. Yet another type of attack is an ARP spoofing attack. And so what happens there is the first thing we see here is we have a device. We have a switch. Remember, we're talking about that MAC table. Actually, this is not the MAC table. This is the ARP cache. ARP cache will be in each one of these devices. Will all have their own ARP cache. The switch doesn't have an ARP cache. So what's going to happen is this device on this network, user A says, I want to connect to 1.1.1.1, but 10.1.1.1, but I don't have its MAC address. So what it does is it sends in an ARP request to the switch. The switch sends out a broadcast out of all its ports, waiting for the one device that has the IP address of 1.1.1.1 to reply. So it sends out that ARP request. It sends that request out all its ports. The switch broadcasts it out all of its ports. And so there's this device right here. It says, yes, that's me. I have the address of 10.1.1. Here is my MAC address. Dun, dun, dun. Uh-oh, the music just changed. Oh, there might be something bad about to happen. Oh, man. As it turns out, there is, because there's a malicious user. How can you tell? It's the hoodie. The hoodie, you can always tell. So the malicious user has been watching this transaction, not just watching it, but they're using a special tool to help out with this. And they respond and they spoof the legitimate user. And they say, yeah, that's me. They always have to do the evil laugh. I'm not sure why they do the evil laugh. But anyway, what happens now is the MAC address for the ARP table of this user has now been set to the MAC address of the attacker. So in fact, if this user tries to interact with this computer, it's not. The entry in the MAC table is forged, and when this user goes to 10.1.1.1, it'll be redirected to the attacker's machine. So I'm sorry, I had to say that in the evil voice because, yeah, the attacker. So that is an ARP spoofing attack. Now we go into some tools. You might be thinking, wow, ARP spoofing, that sounds fun. Well, if you want to try it out, here's a tool for you called ARP Spoof. What it does is it redirects packets from a target or to all hosts to a specific address. Mostly, though, we'll be using tools like BetterCap and EtherCap. Both BetterCap and EtherCap are very, very useful tools for man-in-the-middle attacks. And one of the first steps in a man-in-the-middle attack is ARP poisoning. So both Better and EtherCap will have ARP poisoning as one of their major capabilities. They're very, very good at it. There's DNS Sniff, man-in-the-middle, MITMF, ARP poison, and others. But yeah, I would recommend for ARP poisoning BetterCap and EtherCap. Another attack is MAC spoofing or duplication. So let's say that I am on a Wi-Fi network. And on the wireless network, as it turns out, only this MAC address is allowed to get on the Wi-Fi network. Oh no, well, I really want to be on the Wi-Fi network. Is there a tear coming down my cheek? Because there should. I'm kind of sad that I'm not on the Wi-Fi network. So what I do is I do some sniffing and I listen and watch and I see, oh, I see what the MAC address is. And then I simply change my MAC address to that MAC address, and cha-ching, I am now in the wireless network. So yeah, you can sniff for, intercept, change your MAC address to any address you want on almost any system where you want to change your MAC address. But wait, there's another one. This one is DNS poisoning. What is DNN? It's the domain name server, domain name service, domain name system. There are a lot of people who call it different things, but domain name server is good enough. What it's responsible for is taking an FQDN. Do you know what an FQDN is? It's a fully qualified domain name. You've seen them before. They're separated by dots, so it could say dev.microsoft.com. That's an FQDN. That FQDN has a specific IP address associated with it. So if I type in dev.microsoft.com and I look for it, a DNS server might be called to provide me with the IP address. I don't memorize 32-bit binary IP addresses. I just don't usually do that. Nor do I memorize 128-bit binary IPv6 addresses. I'm just not that good at memorizing binary numbers, but my DNS server is great at it. And so I query the DNS server. The DNS server finds the IP address of the FQDN, remember, fully qualified domain name, sends that IP address to me, and then it is cached so that next time I won't have to ask the DNS server. So whenever you see the term poisoning, it is to put improper entries into a table that maps one thing to another. So in this case, what will happen is a legitimate website IP address will be poisoned, replaced by the IP address of the attacker. Oh no, that's going to lead to some bad stuff, because now if I type in dev.microsoft.com, I will get a fake Microsoft page, and maybe something might pop up and say, click here to close this box, and I click on it, and it's malware, and then there's drive-by malware on there, and there's all, it's horrible, right? It's bad stuff. So DNS poisoning can lead to pretty bad circumstances. Another one is a tool that you want to be aware of for taking care of sniffing. If you want to do sniffing, this is the primary tool. And you need to get to know this. And that's why we have iLabs, where you can practice using tools like Wireshark. Wireshark is really cool. You capture, interactively browse traffic that's running on your computer. There are filters that you can use with Wireshark. You can see some of the frames that were captured. See how it says frame right there? And then inside that frame, remember I said there was a packet, so you can see Internet Protocol, or IP, right? It found the packet. And inside that packet is the TCP segment with the payload. You can see some of the payload information here. There are other packet sniffers that are really nice, like Central Packet Analyzer, CAPTCHA, Network Analyzer, Observer Analyzer, and others, all kinds of. And there are packet sniffers that only run in terminal mode on Linux, and there's so many out there that actually do a very, very good job. All right, let's talk about sniffing countermeasures, because you don't want an attacker finding all this stuff and then changing things and hacking away at your network. So how do you take care of it? Here are some countermeasures. The first one is restricting physical access. I don't know if you remember, but just at the beginning of this module, I gave you a little scenario of how somebody would find a physical port. How did they do it? They went into the conference room, and in the conference room on the wall, there was a place where they could plug in their computer. There may be places, maybe ports, where they could plug in their Cat5e or Cat6 cable on the walls of your organization, in conference rooms of the organization, near the front desk of the organization. There are a lot of places to plug in, but what we want to do is make it so that those ports don't actually allow access into the network. So restricting physical access. Number one, end-to-end encryption. This is especially important when you're dealing with Wi-Fi, with wireless, but it's also important for wired. Also, permanently add the MAC address to the gateway, to the ARP cache. So remember how I told you that you can open up a window for PowerShell or for a command prompt for your Microsoft computer system, or a terminal window for your Linux or Mac, and you can type in ARP and then put a space in there and then do -A, and it lists out all of your ARP entries, right? So yes, you can do that. You'll notice that some of the entries have the word dynamic by them, and some of them have the term static by them. The static entries never change. The dynamic entries are discovered on the fly. One of the most found dynamic entries is the entry on that list to get out of your network to your default gateway. So see right here, the gateway. So if you see 192.168.0.1 in your ARP table with a MAC address, and it says dynamic by it, or you see 192.168.1.1 in your ARP table, and then there's a MAC address, because you're doing this from home. Those are two common addresses for gateways. That can be rerouted by an attacker. So especially in your office, what you want to do is take that gateway address and its MAC address, and when you roll out an image for your desktops and for your servers, in that image, you have a static entry for your MAC address and your gateway. That way, your systems don't have to go look for those, and nobody can spoof them. Nobody can spoof those and then redirect traffic from your gateway into an attacker. Use static IP addresses and ARP tables. Again, same thing as this to a certain extent. Turn off network identification broadcasts if possible, so that attackers won't be able to spoof those, take advantage of them. Restrict network to authorized users to protect it from being discovered with sniffing tools. So there are ways to detect if there's a sniffer on your network. Is there a sniffer hiding out on my network? How do you know if there is or if there isn't? Well, it's very important to understand what a sniffer is. I spent a few minutes at the beginning of this segment talking about that NIC that's in promiscuous mode. Two things that a NIC in promiscuous mode will do. Number one, the NIC in promiscuous mode will read any frame irrespective of MAC IP address combination. Number one. Number two, it'll also very often do a reverse lookup. We can use these two items to try to find out if a specific computer system is running a sniffer. So in promiscuous mode, when somebody sends a ping with the wrong MAC address, see this MAC address right here is the real MAC address, but it has a wrong one in a ping message. Guess what? The machine says, yeah, hey, how's it going? Gotcha. It responds. That is a NIC running in promiscuous mode, right? If it's not in promiscuous mode, and I put the incorrect MAC address, this machine will just drop the frame. So that's one way to tell if a sniffer is in your network. There's also the DNS message, and that's one of the things I was talking about earlier, is normally that's NIC that's in promiscuous mode will also do a DNS lookup. And so if there is a machine that when I ping it does a reverse lookup, it's probably running a sniffer. There's another technique to detect sniffers. This is the ARP method. And this ARP method also relies on some of the characteristics of machines that are running in promiscuous mode. So only the machine that's running in promiscuous mode caches the ARP information because the ARP information is wrong. But the machine running in promiscuous mode just doesn't care. So the machine in promiscuous mode actually responds to ping messages. It has the correct information, or at least I think it does, in the ARP cache. The rest of the machines will send an ARP probe to say, hey, where's that coming from? But not this machine. It's already cached it. It thinks it's right. It thinks it has everything. So you can go through and do this, but also there are tools that you can use to detect sniffers on the network. Microsoft makes a tool. Also, there is a script that you can run from Nmap that will detect sniffers on your entire subnet if you want to. Denial of service, or DOS, distributed denial of service, or DDoS. Let's talk about that. All right, so with denial of service, that is when there is such a flood of information that the service, whatever it is, it could be a web server, it could be a DNS server, it could be a database server, it can't function because of the flood of data. So that's what it is. It reduces, it restricts access, and only all that non-legitimate traffic is able to hit that network, and no legitimate traffic is able to do so. So a bigger version of that is a DDoS attack. And a DDoS attack is where we distribute that attack, giving it to multiple zombie computers. They're shambling, they're shuffling, they're zombies. So there's zombie computers, and these zombie computers are infected, and they have a botnet software on them, and they can be used to attack a third party. There are several different types of attacks that you can do. A UDP flood. What is that? Well, in layer 4 of the OSI model, we have both protocols, TCP and UDP, as primary protocols. And you can send such a large amount of TCP segments at the target that it is no longer able to communicate. So you can do that. The legitimate applications will become inaccessible, give an error, destination unreachable because of the UDP flood. The next type is an ICMP flood. ICMP is the same protocol that's used for ping and traceroute. And so the attacker is going to send a huge amount of ICMP echo requests to that target server, blocking off, reaching that maximum limit, and stopping communications from that device. The next one we see is the ping of death. There needs to be an echo whenever you say that. I don't know. Ping of death, right? What the ping of death does is it sends a malformed frame into this target server. So what happens is the packet size of 65538 is sent to the server. This is too large, exceeding the limit of 65535 under RFC 791. If you want to read RFC 791, just go to a browser and type in RFC 791 IETF into your search and hit enter, and then you'll find the RFC. And if you read through it, do it right before it's time to go to sleep, and then you just wake up in the morning. It's great. Very good reading on RFC 791. They can be RFCs can be a little bit boring, but they can be extremely informative. So that defines those limits. And now, normally, back in the old days, once you send that malformed packet to that server, it just crashes hard. But these days, they're protected against it for the most part. The next type of attack is a Smurf attack. If at the corner of your eye you see something flying towards you and you realize that a whole bunch of small blue creatures are flying at you, then you probably have another problem, because a Smurf attack does not involve any blue creatures, even though Smurfs are blue creatures. Was this named after, or just named after the creatures, okay? So what happens with a Smurf attack is this attacker, again, using ICMP, we see that protocol being used again, it sends a bunch of echo requests. But what the attacker is doing is spoofing the IP address of the target, the victim. And to a huge number of computers, all these echo requests. And then when these computers reply, guess what they reply back to? Whoosh. Hear that noise? That's how it sounds when there's a Smurf attack and that victim gets overwhelmed by ICMP requests, echo requests, and is not able to do anything else until the attack is over. Another type of attack is a SYN flood. And I'm not talking Las Vegas here. This is a different type of SYN. This is SYN. This is part of the way TCP communicates. TCP three-way handshake starts with this. Check it out. A SYN, this computer says, hey, I would like to have a TCP session and communicate with you, host B. Host B sends back a SYN ACK saying, yeah, let's do it. I acknowledge, see that ACK, that you want to communicate with me. And then this computer A sends back an ACK saying, I acknowledge that we're going to communicate. And then they start sequencing acknowledge, sending segments to each other, and everything is happy. And you can roll the credits now. But no, it's too late, because an attack is about to happen. Host A has turned into evil host A and is now going to attack host B. How does evil host A do it? Well, what evil host A does is sends in a SYN and doesn't wait for the SYN ACK from host B, but sends another SYN, but doesn't wait and keeps on just sending SYNs over and over and over and over again. No response back, flooding that entire channel and making it unavailable for communications. That is the SYN flood attack. Yet there are other attacks, like for instance, DDoS, DoS, fragmentation attack. And with a frag attack, what happens is we're trying to stop the destination of our attack, that victim, from reassembling fragmented packets. What we're doing is we're going to flood that target system with a huge number of TCP UDP fragments. But guess what? They're fragments. And so the attacker sends huge numbers of fragments to the target. Usually it's going to be a web server. But the reassembling of these packets, putting them back into the actual full packet, takes up so many resources because they're just being sent over and over and over and over and over again that the destination device gets stopped from doing any other work. Okay, so sometimes they are multi-vector attacks. So volumetric protocol, application-based attacks, multiple types of attacks, multiple vectors of attacks, combination to overwhelm that victim. There also can be peer-to-peer attacks. This usually results from file sharing, peer-to-peer file sharing. And what will happen is there will be an accidental connection to a fake website for the target computer, and they're using DC++, which is the Direct Connect protocol, for sharing files of all types between clients. But since they connected to the wrong client, the attacker, right over here, see, has that hoodie on, we know we're in trouble, and they're able to do a massive denial of service attack against those peer-to-peer workstations. Yet another attack technique is what's called permanent denial of service attack. A permanent denial of service attack results in the complete destruction of the victim's PC. One is called flashing, and what this does, again, causing irreversible damage to the hardware. Another one is when you sabotage the hardware, where you have to replace it. Another one is so bad it bricks the system. A lot of this is often done using fraudulent hardware updates and causing the firmware of that device, the BIOS, the UEFI of that device to be completely messed up so much that the device can no longer even run. And what you do with that device is you unplug it from the network and from power and so on, and when you're after the attack, and then you go take the door outside your office, and then you just put it next to the door to prop it open. That's all it's worth after that, for the most part. So yeah, that's a permanent denial of service attack. But yet there are others, like distributed reflection denial of service attack, where we not only attack a primary target, but we use intermediary victims, installing software on these intermediary victims to attack that target. And so it reflects all the traffic. So if I am an investigator and I say, oh man, my target in Australia was attacked, and that makes me mad, I'm going to find out who did it. And I trace it back, I find these guys, the secondary victims. And then I trace it back and I find the intermediary victims, and I might lose the trail and not find the attackers. That's why they do distributed reflected denial of service attacks. All right, let's have a look at some of the tools of the trade for DDoS attacks. One of them is the innocuous looking hping3. It's a nice little command line tool. See it right there, hping3. See it down here, hping3, that you can use. One of the features of HPing3, it's not just pinging something, right? Don't think it's just for pinging. It can do packet crafting, where I can tell it what to do with things like TCP flags and change the way an ICMP packet or echo request is sent, TCP or UDP, and use it as part of an attack against a system. As you can see right here, /flood. So I craft the packet the way I want, and then I flood using HPing3. But yet, a more powerful tool than HPing3 is the high orbit ion cannon. So if you want to catch rebels fleeing from the Star Wars Empire, you can use the high orbit ion cannon. Or you can just use this software right here on Earth to attack targets. Now, it's really cool. One of the most interesting things about the high orbit ion cannon and the low orbit ion cannon, one of the most interesting things, in my opinion, are the buttons. Look at that. Fire to laser. That's the button. Or I'm a charging my laser. Isn't that crazy how they name the buttons? I don't know. I think that's just very funny. But either one of these, the first one, high orbit, it does DDoS attacks to any IP address, any user. You can select the protocol, and then you hit the fire to laser button and take them down. Low orbit ion cannon. One of the things about low orbit ion cannon, not only can you have target sites, flood them with TCP packets and UDP packets and HTTP and disrupt service and so on, but it runs, you can create your own hack phone on an Android platform, and you can run LOIC on your phone and even attack from your phone. Also, be careful, these tools are very powerful. They're available for download and use. Don't use them on any target that hasn't signed a contract with you asking you to do it, right? Very powerful tools. XOIC, Hulk, Tor, Hammer, slow lowers, pi lowers, are you dead yet? Many other tools that can be used for DDoS attacks. All right, let's have a look at some DDoS countermeasures. One of the first things I always talk about two subjects for protecting your computer systems, and those are ubiquitous encryption, encryption for all data, data at rest, data on the fly, data in use. That's number one. And number two is extensive IAM, and that's identity management. AAA, authentication, authorization, accounting, have both of those. And those are some of the tools that we'll see for countermeasures all throughout this module. And we see here one of those, strong encryption, WPA2, WPA3, the best encryption you can afford. The other one is block all inbound packets originating from service ports. You want to block the traffic from reflection servers. So be careful to only allow traffic that has been trusted for your network. Ensure that software protocols are up to date. So run up-to-dates on your protocols, run up-to-dates on your machine, scan them thoroughly, see if there are anomalous behavior. That can be the beginning of a DDoS attack. Your kernel, update, disable unwanted service. That falls under the auspice of the title of hardening that computer system. Prevent transmission of fraudulently addressed packets at the ISP level. So we want to make sure that every packet that's coming from the internet into our network has a legitimate IP address, legitimate MAC address. So there are tools that can help you defend against DDoS and DOS. And one of those is the Anti-DDoS Guardian. So this is one of the guardians that protects against DDoS to your web servers like IIS, Apache game servers, Camfrog servers, mail servers, all kinds of stuff. Imperva, DOSSmart, DOSGuard, Cloudflare, and F5. F5, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they have made their fame for load balancers for networks, but they do all kinds of great DDoS protection also. Let's talk about session hijacking. With session hijacking, you may not even know that somebody hacked your session because you're going to connect to a resource, you're working with the resource, and all of a sudden you reconnect and you may start over, but you don't realize that during the time of your connection and reconnect in that small slice, somebody took over your original session and they're communicating now. You may not even notice that your session's been hijacked. Let's talk about session hijacking. So with session hijacking, it is where there's a valid TCP communication between two hosts, where they set up the session, they're sending data back and forth. What's going to happen is the attacker is going to sniff the traffic and then take it over. We'll talk about some of the methods for that. And do identity theft, do information theft, set it up for fraud. All kinds of potential badness can occur because of session hijacking, stealing IDs, authenticate themselves with that ID. All that can happen with session hijacking. So it's successful because of account lockout. There's no account lockout. So the hijacker can spend their time hacking away at that account. And also the session ID information is invalid, or there's a weak algorithm that's easy to figure out, or the session IDs aren't handled very well, or infinite timeout, meaning that you have as much time as you want to hack those session IDs and that session. And most computers are running TCP/IP, and TCP/IP can be pretty predictable in how it sets up TCP sessions and connections. And if you're running countermeasures to protect against session hijacking, they're not going to work without using encryption. So encryption is the key countermeasure. We'll talk about that when we get a little bit deeper into this section. What's the process of session hijacking? So what the attacker is going to do is they're going to place themselves between the victim and the target, sniffing that network, monitoring the flow of packets, TCP segments, and predicting how those sequence numbers work, and then desynchronization occurs. So when a TCP session between two hosts is happening, it's almost like a dance between them. They're synchronized. Host A will send 1,000 TCP segments to host B. Host B will say, hey, thanks, I got those, send more. Host A will send more. Host B will have some network congestion and say, hey, I'm changing my window size to 250, send 250 segments. And host B will say, yeah, here's 250. And they'll send more, they'll sequence, acknowledge. There'll be sequence numbers that you can follow, acknowledgments numbers that you can follow. There's a little dance between, they're synchronized, and then we throw one of them off. We desynchronize that session by calculating those sequence numbers and then telling the host, hey, send more, but send it to my IP address. And then once they predict that, they can take over the session. And now that the session belongs to the attacker, they can begin injecting packets of their own into that server, commands, etc., and take it over, hijacking that session. So there are passive and actives. In a passive one, the attacker hijacks a session, but they're just watching. They're just watching it. They're looking to see what happens. They're downloading stuff, right? But just watching. In an active one, they seize control of the session. So there are several different session hijacking levels based upon the OSI model. Now, if you are unfamiliar with the OSI model, here's what I'd like you to do, because I've mentioned it several times. Go into DuckDuckGo, type in OSI model, and then go to images, and then look at all the different images for the OSI model. You'll see it's a 7-layer model. If you want to memorize it, you can type in memorize OSI model, and there will be mnemonics to help you remember it. You should be familiar with it. If you get a chance, just spend some time studying the OSI model. Well, at layer 3 of the OSI model, did you see that on the image in the OSI model images? At layer 3, that's the network layer where we find packets, IP addresses, the IP protocol, etc. Layer 3, we can intercept packets to hijack the session. And then we look at TCP or UDP, which is going to be at layer 4, and run that hijack starting, though, at layer 3. At layer 7 of the OSI model, what does that say on layer 7 on the image that you're looking at? That is the application layer of the OSI model. And you can gain control of an application. Specifically, in this case, we're looking at web services like HTTP user sessions. And in that case, instead of calculating the the TCP session, we steal or obtain and make use of session IDs. We also have a difference between spoofing and hijacking. Spoofing is when you pretend to be something else. So for instance, you'll capture IP address by sniffing and then change your IP address to that, or capture MAC address information by sniffing and then change your MAC address to that. That's a spoofing type of attack. But session hijacking is when you find an active session and take it over. It is now owned by the attacker. There are tools that attackers and network professionals like you make use of. One is called OWASP. It's a nice little tool with all kinds of capabilities for testing vulnerabilities in web applications and hacking web applications, by the way. Another one that I like even better than OWASP Zap that you can find at portswigger.net and on Kali Linux and Parrot Security OS is Burp Suite. Burp Suite also not only acts as a great tool for many things, but it's great for taking a website and hacking it. You can use other things like, for instance, a file full of passwords and another file full of usernames. And you can use various types of attacks to attack web servers. You can monitor. It's just a great tool overall. BetterCap, Websploit, SSL Strip. SSL Strip is really interesting. What it'll do is, let's say that there's a website and it's HTTPS, and you want to run a sniffer and do some hacking on that website, but you can't because everything is encrypted. It's HTTPS. You run SSL Strip, and if the site allows a switch over to HTTP, SSL Strip will force it to go HTTP where you can run sniffing on it. Pretty cool little tool. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is session hijacking attack countermeasures. How do you avoid session hijacking? And there are a couple of detection methods that you can use. The main one is going to be automatic detection. You want intrusion detection system and intrusion prevention system always running in the background on your network to make sure that if a session hijack starts, you get an alert or it blocks it immediately. But there's also the manual method where you can run a sniffer, use packet sniffing software, and find out what's going on. So if you want to block session hijacking, what do? Well, first of all, ubiquitous encryption, right? Use SSH for your communications. Ensure that all your transit is encrypted. Run in defense in depth. Log out automatically from sessions to end them so that they're not just sitting there for an attacker to make use of. Generate the session ID after successful login and accept the IDs generated by the server only. Now, how in the world are you going to take care of that? Well, this is something that a dev team that is creating an application needs to do. Use a string or long random number as a session key. Is this something that you are going to do yourself? No. This is something that your programmers, your dev team, who are putting together your web app, They need to do that, right? Use different usernames and passwords for different accounts. And that's definitely something you or I can do. So if you want to detect session hijacking, one of the tools that you can use is the exceptional, the venerable Wireshark. It's a very cool tool. You'll see some of the Wireshark in your lab, in your iLabs. We'll be looking at that in a little while here. Helps you capture, interactively browse traffic on your computer network. Many other tools like USM Anywhere, Checkpoint IPS, Logarithm, or even SIMs. SIMs are security event managers that really help to gather all the logs from every location and analyze them. IBM Security Network Intrusion Prevention System. And of course, like I always say, there are many other tools that you can make use of to help not only detect session hijacking, but prevent session hijacking. And there are even more tools to help you conduct session hijacking. All right, so in this module, we've been looking at some of the network level attacks, packet sniffing countermeasures. We looked at denial of service, distributed denial of service, some countermeasures for that. And lastly, we were able to examine some session hijacking. And now it's time for you to go to iLabs and make sure you practice using these, setting up the attack and the countermeasure. And in the next module, we're going to go into some detail on web application threats and web application countermeasures. And that's all I have for this module. So why don't you join me for the next one in the next few minutes?